Hi, everyone. We're so excited to get started here. Welcome to Headwater Science Institute's special Big Day of Giving event. My name is Megan Joyce. I do a bunch of communications for Headwaters, and I'm really excited that tonight we're discussing climate change, changes to the water cycle, and more with Dr. Laurel Larsen. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention today is the Big Day of Giving. It's an annual 24-hour giving challenge coordinated by the Sacramento Region Community Foundation, and it is to help nonprofits raise funds for community-focused programs. So because of our generous community, we can bring in dollars that help provide programs to over 1,300 students last year, and with 500 served from community funds alone. So expanding access to science is really important to Headwaters, and our ability to offer financial assistance, scholarships, and secure grants is critical. This evening's event is free thanks to some of our incredible sponsors, including the Tahoe Donner Homeowners Association and Jones Snowboards. But we are always accepting donations that support Headwaters programs. And tonight, any size contribution will give us the chance to win additional prizes through the Big Day of Giving. And so tonight we're joined by Dr. Laurel Larsen, Associate Professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of Geography and Civil and Environmental Engineering, and Delta Lead Scientist for the USGS Delta Stewardship Council. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Larsen. We are excited to hear a bit about you and your work, and everyone should feel free to add questions through the chat throughout the night. We'll have time for discussion at the end.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I look forward to talking to you all. Thank you for being here. I am Laurel Larsen, and in my professional identity, I would describe myself first and foremost as a hydroecologist. That's someone who studies the role of water in ecosystems. And in my research, my work has taken me to diverse and complex environments such as the Florida Everglades, the Chesapeake Bay, Southern Louisiana, and more recently, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is really at the heart of water management in California. I find that I'm drawn to complexity in terms of how humans with different interests come together and manage natural resources and try to create a future that is brighter and more sustainable. And it is that draw that really brought me to the Delta Stewardship Council. So as the Delta lead scientist, I'm on a 4-year term position, and this is a federally funded role that's housed within a state agency. I'm tasked with leading the Delta Science program within that agency. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I also wanted to acknowledge that the work that I do, the research that I do, the science leadership that I do is not done in isolation. There's a whole team of people working behind me. And so one of my greatest joys in my career is working with my laboratory group at Berkeley, the Environmental Systems Dynamics Laboratory. And today I'm going to be sharing the work of the 4 people highlighted here with arrows. I'd also like to acknowledge that the funding for this work comes from diverse sources, including the National Science Foundation, U.S. Geological Survey, and Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So the way I'm going to structure my talk today is to start out by talking about some of the research that we do in our lab that's quite relevant to the challenges that we face here in California. And then I'll segue into how work like that can be applied for environmental governance. And so as part of the introduction, I also just want to give you a brief introduction to the Delta Stewardship Council, the agency that I'm housed within. This is a fairly young agency. It was founded in 2009 by the Delta Reform Act, and it tasked the agency with the mission of implementing what's known as the co-equal goals for managing the Delta. These are goals for providing more reliable water supply for California, and also protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem, all in a manner that protects and enhances the unique cultural, recreational, natural resource, and agricultural values of the Delta as an evolving place. So the Delta Science program, which I lead, is a part of the Delta Stewardship Council, and our mission is also handed to us by the Delta Reform Act. It's to provide the best possible unbiased scientific information for water and environmental decision-making in the Bay Delta system. And we do this through several core functions. We have a program that funds research, including research to students at the graduate to postdoctoral level. We synthesize science, which basically means we try to tell a big picture story out of that emerges from a number of different individual studies. We communicate scientific information to policymakers and decision makers. We promote robust and independent science by facilitating scientific peer review of government programs and documents. And we coordinate with a number of different agencies to promote science-based adaptive management. So with that brief introduction, I think I'm going to go ahead and segue into my talk. And one of the things that I learned from the organizers is that many of you are in California, but there's also a substantial fraction of you outside of California. And regardless of whether you're Californian or not, I would be surprised if you haven't seen some of the headlines of the wacky and wild weather that we've been having really over the past decade in California, where last year we were making headlines for our drought being the worst in 1,200 years. And we saw maps where much of the state was in the most severe or second most severe category of drought. And then just in this year, we've transitioned into a situation where the Sierra Nevadas currently have over 400% of their typical water content preserved within the snowpack. So that's an incredible flip-flop. And one question is whether this is surprising to scientists. And I'll say yes and no. Climate scientists have long been telling us that climate change will bring increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme events like the ones we've seen in California in recent years, and frankly, throughout the nation. But there are still a lot of questions that scientists have to answer. For example, the models showed that this past water year, the year that we're in right now, actually, was a La Nina year and predicted to be another dry year. So this transition out of drought that we experienced was not anticipated by the models. And then when we were in the drought last year, the models that our regulatory agencies use to plan water operations grossly overestimated the amount of water available to fill reservoirs during the melt period. And that's because they overestimated the water content of snowpack and underestimated the soil moisture deficit. So there are clear reasons that we have to be humble as scientists and clear uncertainties that we need to fill. And in fact, those mistakes that were made in the modeling process led the California Legislative Assembly to call for an audit of the models used by the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board. So this illustrates how science and scientific uncertainty loom large in the public eye right now. Now, another thing that I would say has been surprising to scientists is just how quickly these predicted changes and extremes have been taking hold. They're taking hold quicker than the models have predicted. So one of the reasons why it's hard to anticipate what California's water future will hold is that there's a lot going on with the water cycle, and many components of the water cycle have the potential to change simultaneously and even in different directions with climate change. So this image that you're looking at is probably one similar to other things that you've been looking at since elementary school earth science. It shows the different components of the water cycle. And some of the ways in which climate change impacts the water cycle are fairly intuitive. You have more surface warming, which can lead to more evapotranspiration, more evaporation from oceans. But some of the things that people don't think about so much are that that this process of evaporation is also happening from hidden water in the subsurface, from soils. And it's also happening directly from snowpack in a process known as sublimation. Other hidden processes that have the potential to experience great change with climate change are declines in water table during drought periods. And here I'm showing a water table that's feeding the stream in the wet period, going to a condition in which the stream is actually losing water during the dry period. And so what this means is that precipitation really needs to fill up the volume of pore space available in the soil and oftentimes change water table positions before we start seeing a response in streams and reservoirs. And then, of course, we've had massive wildfires throughout the West that change surface heating properties and can change the amount of evapotranspiration happening from the land surface. And then what about precipitation? Well, precipitation changes might not be immediately intuitive, but they are once you consider a pretty simple law of thermodynamics, which is known as the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. And what this equation predicts, or what it shows, is that with increases in temperature here on the x-axis, you get an exponential increase in the amount of water contained within a volume of air. So essentially, warm air holds much more water than cool air. And when you consider that, it makes sense that precipitation is becoming more intense in some of these storm events. Some scientists have actually looked at the scaling of precipitation intensity and found that it scales pretty well with the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. But then in some places, we're actually seeing precipitation intensities that exceed that scaling relationship. And the thinking there is that, this evaporation isn't just happening from a point. You could be evaporating from a surface and creating 100% humidity from that particular place in space, but then you also have wind, you have air masses that are being transported into a region and potentially converging that could lead to even higher amounts of moisture at particular places and particular times. So this just underscores that the effects of these multiple simultaneous changes are complex. They can be difficult to anticipate with models. But I'll say, as with many other sectors, technology has the potential to be a game changer with environmental science. And in fact, in recent decades, we've seen an explosion in sensing capabilities. And this is true for remote sensing. This is true for the design of new sensors that enable us to optically detect water quality or measure things such as sap flow within trees, which are some of the sensors that you're looking at here. Our federal agencies and state agencies have invested in infrastructure to fund environmental observatories like the Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory. So one question is, what can we learn from big data about how these different components of water balances are changing, and use those observations then to inform our predictive models? This is actually a tricky question that relies not just on the existence of this technology, but on people to perform that synthesis. Environmental science faces several big data challenges that aren't unique to our field. While we are funding these observatories in a number of different locations, the conventions under which data are collected differ from place to place. The data formats differ from place to place. And many times the way in which the raw data is processed into the data sets that are distributed to the public also differ from place to place. So there's a tremendous amount of work on the back end to synthesize data sets in order to gain large-scale understanding of hydrologic phenomena. And this is work that one of my students, Liang Zhang, has invested in. She developed a synthetic data set called the Comprehensive Hydrologic Observatory Sensor Network, or CHOSEN, which combines data on many different water cycle-related variables from critical zone observatories and long-term ecological research sites throughout the US. And these different variables are indicative of different processes within the water cycle, including evapotranspiration, or ET in the legend, snow, soil moisture, precipitation, and discharge, which is a word hydrologists use to describe stream flow. What you're looking at in these plots are trends in the magnitude or frequency of extreme events in these records, either extreme high events or extreme low events. And the size of these bubbles refers to the number of measured variables at each of these places that are experiencing statistically significant changes or statistically significant trends in these extreme hydrologic events. Now, the different colors just show you what those trends, what water cycle components those trends are related to, and the arrows show whether the trends are increasing over time or decreasing over time. So there's a lot of nuance that comes from looking at these plots, but one big takeaway is that there seem to be some hot spots in the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, the Northeast, and Florida. And interestingly, these hotspots are predicted to be hotspots for multivariate trends in extreme events that emerge from climate models. And in some places, we're seeing the emergence of these trends at a time even earlier than they're predicted to emerge from these climate models. One of the other neat things that Liang was able to do with this data set is look at certain types of trends. So trends in low flow extremes that are either indicative of stream flow drying in red or wetting in blue. And sometimes some of those trends go in both directions, and those are being shown in purple. But she was able to really look at what these wetting or drying trends were associated with in terms of different components of the water balance. And there's not a lot of data here in terms of the significant low flow extreme trends, but for several of these points, she did see that there was an association with higher rates of evapotranspiration. So before I get ahead of myself, I just want to say this type of analysis allows us to look to the past and also the present to see how these different components of the water balance are changing. But how about the future? Now, this is where it is appealing to harness the growing prowess of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so this is another thing that my lab group has been investigating. And I'll say that we're not alone in investigating this. As you can imagine, many hydrologists are interested in looking at the potential for machine learning to improve our forecasts of stream flow and precipitation and other hydroclimatic events. And one thing that we're almost universally finding is that these machine learning or deep learning models allow us to generate better forecasts than the former physically based or mechanistic models allowed us to do. And in this slide, I'm highlighting one example of a stream flow forecasting model developed by my student Salem Adera for Alameda Creek, which is one of the water sources for the city of San Francisco. And what she's plotting here is a measure of performance where ideally you want to be somewhere up high on this axis. And basically what you're seeing here is that for these three different types of physical models on the left side of the plot, whether or not we're talking about models that have been calibrated to this specific location or whether a more generic form is used, the performance of these physical models is lower than the performance of a deep learning model known as an LSTM model. I'm going to get into a little more detail here, but I just want to take a higher look at what's going on within these deep learning models. So LSTM stands for long-term, short-term memory model. And basically what this model is doing is it's taking an input of time series of temperature and precipitation, and based on just those two variables, it is predicting stream flow. So one of the features of these deep learning models is that they're really good at learning the inherent memory of hydrological processes. And so it's also taking information about stream flow predictions at previous points in time and using that to generate estimates of stream flow at the next time step together with this temperature and precipitation data. So these models are often viewed as somewhat of a black box, but if you think about it, in order for one of these models to be successful, it needs to figure out what's happening within the water cycle and how precipitation is partitioned into these different fluxes that move through watersheds. And one of the nice things about these models is that you could actually open the hood of this black box or open the black box itself and look at some of the what's known as hidden states within the model, which are essentially mathematical combinations of this temperature and precipitation data over some historical period of time together with historical stream flow. And it keeps track of these hidden states. And what my students are finding is that these hidden states, if you look at how their values evolve over time, they're very closely matching variables that the model was never trained on and never saw that are indicative of this partitioning within the water cycle. So here you're looking at hidden cell states value in orange, and it matches up very well with measured snow water equivalent for a watershed in Oregon. And this is another hidden state that very closely tracks measurements of soil moisture. So this is pretty incredible. I feel a little bit blown away by seeing these results. But it begs the question, if these models are so good, why aren't we using them operationally in places like California? And there's an interesting paper that came out in 2021 that sheds some light on this question of why we're not using these models operationally. This is a paper that went through the process of developing a new water supply forecast model for the American West that's being used by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they laid out a number of different design criteria for an ideal forecasting model. And I just want to highlight a couple of these. One is that the model has to be geophysically consistent and explainable from a physical standpoint, but it also needs to balance innovation and performance gains with established building blocks and proven tools. And this brings up the issue of trust in models. Many people still view these machine learning or deep learning models as black boxes that aren't necessarily trustworthy. And in fact, this team of authors didn't even consider deep learning models in their process because they explicitly said they were acting too much like a black box. So one of the things that our lab group is trying to do is investigate whether these generally well-performing models can also be made more trustable for eventual operational adoption. So I'm going to go back to this forecast that my student developed for Alameda Creek. And one of the things that she investigated is whether we can essentially use these three physical models as a basis for prediction, but then bring a deep learning model in to predict what the error of those physical models is going to be. Because if you could predict the error, you could then correct for it. And she found that when she developed models that used this hybrid approach, the performance, and there's several different flavors through which you could do that. Those are just the four new bars that are being shown. But regardless of the flavor of this hybrid model, the performance was better than both the physical models and the standalone deep learning models. And so this is a technique that holds promise. My other student, Liang, has been investigating another strategy in which she starts with a deep learning model, but then constrains it with physics. She constrains it with a requirement to meet a water balance, essentially to conserve mass over a certain time scale. And there's a way in which she could implement this constraint so that she could look at a spectrum of performance from purely data-driven models to purely physical models over here on the right. And she developed several different scoring criteria to look at trade-offs for physical consistency, accuracy, and generalizability to conditions that the model hasn't seen before, like extreme wet conditions or extreme dry conditions. And what this example for the H.J. Andrews Preserve in Oregon is showing is that probably a hybrid model is going to best optimize these three different outcomes. So with that, I'm going to segue to California. And, I kind of ended the research segment of this talk by talking about the importance of trust in models. And this is the connection to the work that we're doing in California, because in California, trust in the scientific process, trust in models has a tremendous historical dimension in a state where science has a history of being highly politicized. And to really understand that, I just want to show you these maps, two different maps of the California water system. We're a state that faces real geographical challenges. We have some of the most variable interannual and intra-annual patterns of precipitation. And our precipitation is also unevenly distributed in space. Most of the water falls in Northern California, yet most of the population resides in Southern California. And so this map over here is really highlighting the importance of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River system. The delta here is shown in red. The delta's watershed is the area in green. We also pump water into this basin from the Trinity River system. But this whole area in yellow, in addition to the area in green, receives water from the delta. And this is only possible through a system that's massively modified by humans, a system where you have lots of reservoirs, which are the triangles over here, as well as water conveyance structures. And so, as you can imagine, and as you've seen in these years of scarcity, there are many competing factors for this critical resource in the state. And there's a lot of conflict that has historically arisen from the uneven distribution of water in the way in which we decide to redistribute water. The other thing that I just wanted to emphasize before I go on is that this delta area really functions as the heart of California. You have water that's being pumped in and out through our pumping network, but then you also have tidal pumping, which is a really significant force within the delta. More water flows in and out into the delta and San Francisco estuary through the pumping of tides than through net river flow. And with that water comes salt. And that's just one important thing to keep in mind. But going back to the conflictual nature of water in California, if any of you have driven down the I-5 corridor down the Central Valley, you've seen signs like this: make California great again, stop dumping 70% of our water in the ocean. So there's this perception that a lot of times, well, there's really two things that are behind this sign. One is the notion that our system of water storage in the state is inadequate. And the second that I hear quite a lot is that we're sending a lot of water to the oceans to support fish populations, including the 2-inch delta smelt, at the expense of exporting water to human populations in Southern California. And this is a notion that I do often try to push back against in the common discourse, and to say that these signs really don't tell us the whole story. There's a really interesting study by the Public Policy Institute of California that I'd like to highlight here that tracks where exactly water does go in the Delta watershed. So you can see that during wet years, the amount of water flowing out of the Delta is approximately 78% of the net runoff during those years. But this is during very wet years when we do have the capacity to meet demands for water. But if you look at what happens during dry years, again, you do see that delta outflow is substantial, but most of that outflow is what is known as system water, which is water needed to push back against tidal forces that would otherwise pump salt into the delta, potentially endangering the freshness of the intakes to the major aqueducts in California for extended periods of time. So most of the outflow during dry periods is thus needed to protect future exports to Southern California. Now, I've had the opportunity to share this type of information at talks and informal conversation in Southern California with people who were initially giving me a hard time about some of the same things that motivated those signs on I-5. But the comments after those conversations were really that we need to have these sorts of conversations and information sharing statewide and more often. And for me, this just underscores how creating shared information and shared data are critical to establishing public trust and shared understanding, and ultimately pushing back against the decades of conflict over water in California and seeking consensus-based solutions. And to do that, I just want to underscore that public processes are really important too, not just information, but public processes, ensuring that science is inclusive of people who might not consider themselves scientists, but are impacted by the outcome of the science that we use. And to illustrate this, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the challenge of salinity management in the Delta, which is one of the state's biggest challenges associated with drought management. Now, during these really dry years, in order to protect some exports for Southern California and just ensure that we even have enough water to push back against these tidal forces that would bring salt into the Delta, the state has developed emergency measures. And the main emergency measure is to construct a hard rock barrier across a part of the Delta that is a little bit northward of the intakes, which are down here, to the State Water Project and Central Valley Project. So FR here stands for the False River. And this is a solution that's been very effective at redirecting salinity away from this critical part of the Delta, but it is a solution that's also come at a cost to local communities within the Delta who have experienced massive expansion of submersed aquatic vegetation or aquatic weeds. It's been a hindrance to recreation in the Delta, and this action is suspected to potentially be a contributor to harmful algal blooms as well. It's not the only tool that we have in our arsenal, though. And in fact, there was a group of many different stakeholders that were convened with state parks and the Delta Stewardship Council and UC Davis to evaluate alternatives for managing the Franks Tract, or this region that's so critical to preservation of beneficial salinity within the Delta. And these groups came together in a series of workshops and developed and evaluated a number of alternative designs for the Franks Tract that used nature-based solutions, mainly wetland restoration, to achieve multiple objectives of redirecting salinity away from this part of the Delta while providing habitat and promoting recreation. And the engineers that worked on the project said that the general public did come to them with ideas that they initially thought were infeasible or not a good idea, but then the act of putting those into the model and evaluating the outcome did change their minds. And I think the solution for managing the Franks Tract that was arrived at is one that no one party could have conceived of before this process began. So there's a tremendous amount of support for planning processes like this for this particular solution. This restoration project has not yet been funded, but is something that is a critical component of the adaptation strategy that the Delta Stewardship Council is now in the process of developing. And this is I'm just going to show this really quickly, but this is just a video that shows the effectiveness of this proposed wetland restoration in keeping salt out of this part of the Delta. So blue here is less salty water. I'm going to move ahead in the interest of time. Let me try to go to my next slide. There we go. Oops, it wants to keep going. And so now, and this will be the final slide here. Now we're trying to scale up these types of inclusive processes to promote broader access to and engagement with water planning information statewide. So I've recently had the privilege of being part of a multi-agency and academic and community-oriented team that has put together a proposal for a project in which we would collectively develop a suite of climate scenarios and different operations and management scenarios that include strategies such as the ones that you see here in the colored writing, and then run those through our water allocation model that's used for statewide planning to develop a library of over 1,000 different potential futures. And then within different focus groups, really drill down into what these water allocation futures could mean for drinking water access for vulnerable communities, for salinity management within the Delta, and then for Chinook salmon recovery. So there's a lot of interest in, I'd say there's a growing interest in government in promoting projects like this, and we're hopeful that this project will get launched. So with that, I think I'm out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into California water and learned something, that you've gotten inspired to engage with the science and are ready to help embrace this challenge of developing and using science in an inclusive manner that engenders trust and helps us work towards collaborative, compromise, or consensus-based solutions. And here's a QR code that you could scan if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Delta Stewardship Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Larsen. That was fascinating. And we have a few questions from the audience. And before I jump in and grab one of our panelists, I did just want to say that you just mentioned so many different fields that are involved in a project like this. You have stakeholder engagement, communication, facilitation and consensus building, data and policy analysis, engineering, modeling, in addition to hydrology and geology. So do you have advice? We have so many students that some are watching tonight, and then so many that come through our programs. Do you have advice on picking one of those paths if you want to get involved in something like this? It seems like you could do anything.
Yeah, that's the great thing. So one of the things that we've recently done in the Delta Stewardship Council and the Delta Science Program is we've kicked off a seminar series on decision-making under deep uncertainty. And our inaugural speaker was Alice Hill, who has written books about adaptation. She worked within the Obama administration on the challenge of climate adaptation. And one of the key takeaways that she left us with is that there is so much applied science that needs to happen to enable our society to adapt to the very rapid and severe changes that we're experiencing as a result of climate change. And so my advice to the listeners is that do science that matters. Follow your passions, pick topics that you're interested in. But the reality is that environmental science these days is so interdisciplinary. I would say, it's useful to have specialists, and it's also useful to have generalists. But one thing that you should pursue in your studies is communication skills, because that communication skills are essential to working across these disciplinary boundaries and ensuring that your work has an impact. And so, I would focus on an area of science, social science, engineering that's really interesting to you and that you have enough passion for to sustain the marathon of efforts that's coming in your career. But then also really try to hone those communication skills, because those will serve you well. And I would say the other thing to perhaps pay attention to is data science literacy, because that is only growing. I even feel like how I was trained is not adequate to really embrace how quickly data science is growing and evolving now. And I rely on my students a lot of times to educate me in order to excel in that area.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I feel like it lines up perfectly with Headwaters programs, getting students started in doing presentations about their research and writing about it in their manuscripts, and then also partnering with Data Classroom and some of Headwaters' other partners just to get everyone introduced to some of that data analysis and data literacy as early as middle school and high school, before they even get to college and grad school. And then following up on that communication piece, what happens when things are surprising to scientists? That was one of the first things you mentioned, some unpredictability, but then you also mentioned communicating with regards to the water storage, the signs that you showed. So how does that impact how you communicate your science if you are uncertain?
Yeah, this is the biggest challenge, I think, in science communication, is how to communicate uncertainty to the general public. There's a classic example where for a while, forecasts of hurricane trajectories were shown as a line that just indicated the central tendency of the model and a cone growing away from that line. And that cone was designed to illustrate that as the hurricane moves further away from the point where it is currently, the models become more uncertain about where it's going to end up. But there was a big public misperception that that cone actually meant that the hurricane was growing in size as it progressed. And so I think that in terms of communicating uncertainty, we need to be adaptive in our approach. We need to be cognizant of misperceptions and on how scientific communication is received. We need to actually try to use a scientific approach to document this and then iterate on the process to make that communication more effective. I think that's probably what I would say about that.
Yeah, those are great things to keep in mind. So I hope everyone is, as they're preparing their next set of research manuscripts, our summer research students are about to start. They'll keep that in mind in their communication. I'm going to bring on, we have Jen Jackson and Shannon Lloyd, who are going to join us as having some questions for you. I think Jen is going to go first with a couple from her.
Hi, Jen. I don't hear any sound from Jen. I think she's muted.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great. And I had seen your slides before, but you filling in so much narrative was so helpful to, to bring it to life. One of my questions for you is that water in California, as you said, is really political. And in early February, Governor Newsom decided, are we not being able to? Sorry, we're getting a little technical.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So Governor Newsom suspended the requirements to send water down the Delta and allowed more water to be stored, partly perhaps due to the water users wanting more water in storage so that we could store up, since we'd just come out of a terrible drought. And so that was a really political move. And I'm curious how a scientist like you or people in the Delta Science program react to that kind of political maneuvering when it may not really be very science-based.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And one thing that we try really hard to do in the science program is, our mission is to be unbiased in the provisioning of science. So we try to create a firewall between scientific information and policy. That said, we need to be cognizant of policy and political sensitivities many times. And we need to be cognizant of politics, because a lot of times the science that we need to provide is driven by political needs or political discourse. And so with this co-equal project that I presented on the final slide, and I could actually go back to that. With this project, one of the things that we recognize is that many times agencies that do have missions and do have agendas for managing water have to hew to those missions, and they tend to be very influenced by political forces, political drivers. And that influence has really stymied their ability to think creatively about the future and think of potential alternatives to managing water that might be outside the realm of current regulations. And so in putting together this team, one of our motivations was to hear a more creative set of ideas from different sectors of the public. We've also been engaging law and policy folks in order to think through what some of these solutions could be and what the consequences of those solutions could be in a safe space, in a space that is a little bit outside of the political realm. But I guess going back to your question about this decision that was made in February, I don't know whether it was before the decision was made or after the decision was made, but I did see some analyses, scientific analyses of what the trade-offs might be for relaxing these requirements for Delta outflow at that particular time of year. And a lot of scientists, actually were somewhat comfortable with that decision because it's a time of year when there are a lot of flows, and we're not really pushing up against thresholds that are important for fish or important for beneficial uses of water based on water quality standards.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I thought that was a really good question. I'm going to sort of piggyback on it a little bit. So how have agencies responded to new changes in technology in sort of adapting, like weather models are a lot more accurate now when they're making decisions about releasing water from dams and things like that? Have they come up to speed, or are they still lagging behind what the sort of technology is able to provide now?
I would say they are in the process of coming up to speed. There's a big push within agencies like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop what's known as forecast-informed reservoir operations. And this would be a big departure from the way our reservoirs were managed in the past. So and into the present, like right now, many of the reservoirs are managed based on the assumption that what we've seen in the past is representative of what happens throughout the year on average, and that there's a certain amount of accommodation space that we need to leave within reservoirs in order to accommodate the runoff that might be coming, which is, just based on historical averages. We need to try to maintain reservoirs within that level to satisfy the dual requirements of flood protection and provisioning of water during our subsequent dry season, or if the next year happens to be a dry year, to have some water in the bank for that. But what we know is that the past is no longer a good representation of what the future holds. The climate models suggest that the precipitation that we do receive is going to be falling in a narrower period of time, that the shoulder seasons or the shoulder periods of that wet season are going to be much sharper. And so some agencies are really quickly trying to modernize their forecasting processes in order to develop new standards for managing reservoirs. I'd say some of the local irrigation districts are ahead of the curve, ahead of the major agencies in implementing these strategies. But I do think we'll get there. It's always a slow process to change entrenched processes, though.
So again, I'm going to, if you had one, are we tag teaming or? So this kind of goes to the models that you're creating. And I'm wondering how do the deep learning models adapt to recent trends that are at variance with long-term historical norms? So you're not able to predict accurately. Like, does it allow for the fact that what's coming in now is so different?
That's a really good question, and is something I am personally very curious about from a research perspective. So what we've learned so far in the work that we've done is that if there's a hint of these trends or a hint of those extreme conditions in the record of time on which the models are trained, they can be pretty good at figuring out those dynamics and generating forecasts that are okay, at least probably better than we can do right now. But answering that question, I think, requires us to develop models, deep learning models that are really adept at actually figuring out those physical processes that govern where water goes and when. And one of the things I'm curious about is that, if we go through a true regime shift where a different set of processes altogether are really driving patterns in stream flow compared to the past, then how much data, how much of a hint do these models need to be able to figure that out? So, it's a great question. I would say we don't know yet. There are indications that there are at least slight hints in the past. These models might be able to predict those conditions, but we just don't know enough yet.
So building off of that question, I have a very basic question, and then one that relates to your presentation. We talk a lot about whatever percentage of snowfall or snow water equivalent we have in a given year. So this year where we live up in Soda Springs, 439%. And so my basic question, is that a rolling average? When we talk about those things, are we taking into account that there is this variability that's happening over time? Or are we looking back historically and comparing it to some specific set of years of historical data?
So we usually report on these numbers too at our Delta Stewardship Council meetings, and I could speak to what we do. When we say something is at 439% of the historical average, it's 439% of the average snow water content over the last 20 years. And, depending on how much data is available, different windows of time might be used, but usually like the past record is lumped to develop that average.
Okay. And then my perhaps more nuanced or interesting question is, in one of your slides, you mentioned the state audit of the different models that are being used by DWR and others. And I'm curious, are there any outcomes from that audit that you can share, or is it too early to know?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. So I don't know what the outcomes are yet. I think the audit is still in process.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
So shifting a little bit and going back to sort of the talk, you showed the example of the salinity barrier and how that didn't work. And so you turned to natural process restoration.
Well, I'm going to just
you're proposing to, right?
Yeah. So the salinity barrier was actually quite effective at redirecting salinity away from this part of the Delta, but it's not without trade-offs, and it has adversely impacted communities within the Delta and ecosystems in parts of the Delta.
So So it was solving a problem, but it was creating other problems. And so you guys are proposing switching to restoration, natural, like marsh restoration and stuff like that. So my question is, in terms of the sort of the Delta plan's adaptive management, how much is going to be devoted to natural process restoration? Do you have an idea? Like, are you guys going more that direction, or?
I would say that is a big emphasis. So wetland restoration is a huge initiative within the council right now. It's a big part of the Delta plan, especially with the recent ecosystem amendment. And there's also the 30 by 30 initiative through which many wetland restoration projects are planned. There's actually a lot swirling around this space in the policy realm and in the planning realm right now. I did mention that the Delta Stewardship Council is developing an adaptation strategy through their Delta Adapts initiative. And my understanding is that at least the draft adaptation strategy includes this Frank's Tract restoration along with a number of other wetlands. So, there's several ways in which wetlands and natural solutions are being thought of as tools that will really help us achieve our adaptation objective. There's recognition that flooded landscapes like inundated floodplains, these could be managed floodplains like the Yolo Bypass, or tidal wetlands are really good rearing habitat that generate a lot of food for native fish species. There's recognition that wetlands are also some of the most productive ecosystems worldwide, and they rapidly pump carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and convert it to biomass, which then gets converted to soil, where it's sequestered for reasonably long periods of time. And so in terms of reversing subsidence within the Delta, which is one of the Delta's challenges, while also moving towards a carbon neutral economy statewide, the Delta is viewed as having really great potential. So I would say that these natural solutions are hugely important in policy that's under development and being considered.
Do you have any, I mean, this has been really a wonderful talk, and we're so appreciative and love this back and forth. Jen, do you have any more questions?
Well, I just have one more. You answered actually one of them, which was about the 30 by 30 and how the Delta Stewardship Plan interfaces with 30 by 30 goals to 30% of land in California for biodiversity. But it's maybe again more basic. There's this conversation that the Delta needs about 80% of its natural flows to protect things like the Delta smelt and other ecosystem services that the Delta provides. And yet, when we looked at your slide where you had water flows during those 2 different years, particularly in a drought year, they say 80%, but we're seeing this really big change in sort of fluxes of big years and small years, low years. And I know that there's, some inherent resilience in natural ecosystems. So to some extent, they can handle a drought year. But when we're talking about these really big extremes, what we're getting here in 2021 was far less than 80%. Can an ecosystem survive without that 80% or whatever is being delivered?
That's a really big question. And there's a lot that's built into that question. When you're asking if an ecosystem can survive, I would say yes, but it might look very different from the ecosystem that was present historically. I'd say one of the grand challenges that we're facing right now in the Delta, and as well as many other ecosystems worldwide, is that we're facing a future where the ecosystems are going to be novel, different from anything that we've seen in the past. And so, I think in terms of policy, there's a lot of work that really needs to be done to create a shared vision on how we want to manage these landscapes, like what functions we want to manage them for. But just getting back to your flow question, this is like the $1 million question in the Delta. It's the question that a lot of the highly contentious negotiations around the voluntary agreements, you might have seen headlines, and I could explain what that is, but the voluntary agreements really centered around. So the story behind the voluntary agreements is that the State Water Resources Control Board is tasked with upgrading the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, which maintains salinity levels in certain parts of the estuary and also has a lot of flow requirements built into that. An alternative pathway to updating the Bay Delta plan is for the parties who are affected by these decisions to come together and voluntarily essentially come up with an alternative strategy for managing the system. And so there were just voluntary agreements that, or there was a memorandum of understanding in support of voluntary agreements that came out in November, early 2022, and then updated in November 2022. And the State Water Resources Control Board is now considering whether to adopt these voluntary agreements. And part of that decision involves the Water Board putting together a scientific basis report. It's actually a supplement to the original Bay Delta Plan scientific basis report. And really what that report focuses on is like what is needed to achieve a doubling goal for salmon within the estuary. Like how do we translate restoration of habitat versus flows into fish population numbers? So this is the $1 million question. I don't think we've yet had the opportunity to collect enough data to be able to address that question conclusively. The Water Board does use models that seem to demonstrate that the voluntary agreements would be adequate, although those models have been have had a lot of criticism. But so the Independent Science Board, which we also work with and convene in the Delta Stewardship Council, submitted a memo about the integrity, really, of this scientific basis supplement. And one of the things that they said is that, if these voluntary agreements go through, it's a really great learning opportunity to address some of these questions more conclusively. And they really challenged the state board and other involved agencies to develop a monitoring strategy that would allow us to do a much better job at answering that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, just thank you so much. This has been so informative, and really appreciate you coming and talking to Headwaters and our community.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really fun conversation, and shout out to all the students out there. This is a really great career. It's very needed. So thank you for your interest, and good luck. Enjoy the journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that chat. And Jen and Shandon, thank you for joining us and asking such engaging questions. Dr. Larsen, I wanted to end with one more question for you, if that's okay. I am borrowing this. We spoke with Austin Parker, who's a wildlife biologist, a couple of weeks ago. And on their podcast, they always ask people what brings them hope. And you are working in highly contentious water management and also in climate change. And so what brings you hope? Is it that there's innovative solutions all the time? Is it that the ecosystem will survive even if it is something we've never seen before? What is it that keeps you going in this work?
Well, the thing that's giving me the most hope right now is that we seem to be at a watershed moment in recognizing that there have been so many inequities embedded in our system of managing natural resources. And I've seen genuine interest within the state government, within non-governmental organizations, in really trying to make our processes more inclusive and include community groups and tribal groups as partners in developing solutions. And, when we just held an adaptive management forum today at the Delta Science program that was focused on inclusive adaptive governance. And one of our speakers said, well, I used to think the key to adaptation lay in better information and better science. And then I realized it's not that. We have the information we need, essentially. We just need people working together more effectively. And then he said, and it's even more nuanced than that. Once I started working together with people in an inclusive space, I realized that people were carrying all of these wounds with them. And we need to create safe spaces to deal with those wounds and to create authentic engagement and meaningful engagement that has true intentionality behind it. And that gives me hope.
I love that. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of your work and more about you and chatting with us and coming to hang out with Headwaters tonight. If everyone who's watching wants to stick around, we do have some trivia based on Dr. Larsen's talk, which will start in a moment. Head over to this link of kahoot.it and or download the app on your phone. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And so then we'll be handing out some prizes, I believe, too. So thank you so much, Dr. Larsen.
Thank you. And I'll say goodbye. I have to pick up my 3-year-old from the babysitter.
Absolutely. So while everyone is downloading Kahoot, getting ready to play trivia, I did just want to mention to all of the students and parents that are participating with us tonight that we have a lot of exciting opportunities this summer. If you are interested in investigating your own research project, whether that's water quality or invertebrates in streams or anything else related to, something that we've talked about here or something entirely different, we have registration open for summer camps in the Truckee Tahoe area. We also have an online research experience program for high school students, and you'll work one-on-one with a mentor and get published in the Headwaters Journal and have the opportunity to be published more widely. So check out the Headwaters website for all of those opportunities and sign up for our newsletter if you have not seen that yet. So it is getting ready to be time for trivia. We have a special code for the game that we have going on tonight, and we'll start that in just a moment. While we're getting ready, we'll have this game pin loaded here. So if you've downloaded the app or joined us online, plug in this game pin. We will be starting momentarily, but please type in your first name and last initial, and that way we know who you are. In case you win, you'll be getting a Headwaters prize pack. We'll leave this up for a minute. And while you're doing that, I did just want to mention again that it is a big day of giving, and Headwaters is hoping to meet our goal of raising $15,000. This money goes to our programs, helps fund scholarships and financial assistance for students and schools, and we're really hoping to expand science access to science with the help of you all. And so there are a couple of specific fundraisers on this page as well. The Leadership Public School in Oakland is doing a fundraiser, as well as a few others. And so we're excited to have them be so excited to put together a Headwaters program and have their fundraisers and bring Headwaters in and get ready to do some awesome hands-on science programs in the fall. All right. If anyone is having any trouble joining our trivia game, just let us know in the chat. We can help figure that out. And again, you can do that through the website or on the app. I think we'll have a countdown for another 30 seconds or so, and then we will get started. All right. We've got the link in the chat for anyone who isn't downloading the app, but I see a couple of players, and we're getting a few others in now too. All right, I think we're ready to get started, and you will get points for both correct answers and for being fast. So try to plug in your answers as quickly and as correctly as possible. right, here we go. True or false? Dr. Laurel Larsen works for UC Berkeley. These are coming up on your phone or website, wherever you have it up. All right, and this is our current leaderboard. Moving on to number 2. According to Open Snow, what was the total snowfall for Soda Springs in March 2023? And you have a couple of inch total options here. All right, we have answers on the screen and our new updated standings. Question number 3, what is a delta? All right, and we have our correct answers are showing with the check marks there. But just a reminder to answer quickly as we've got 20 seconds on each. We have a change in our leaderboard, so that is fun. Our next question, question number 4, is how will sea level rise impact freshwater in the Delta? The water will become saltier is our correct answer for that one. Our next, yes, our leaderboard had a change back to the top there. Question number 5 about Headwaters. What year was Headwaters founded? Our correct answer here is 2014, which we have some very knowledgeable players. Everyone got that one right. Traffic Girlies has a streak with 3 correct answers in a row. Good going there. Our next question is question number 6. What is sublimation? Couple seconds left. All right, we have 4 correct answers here. Question number 7. Climate change happens over time and is primarily caused by an increased amount of what in our atmosphere? All right. Our updated standings. The Headwaters team has a streak with 3 correct answers in a row. I think that started with what year Headwaters was founded, so that's a pretty good streak. Our next question, question 8. How can extreme events like hurricanes, drought, and wildfires impact energy and infrastructure? All of those answers are accurate, and we have a change at the top of the leaderboard. Again, answer quickly, and I think you get more points for answering fast and correct. Our next question, name the 2 main tributary rivers that flow into the California Delta. Correct answers there. It is tight at the top. All right, we have a few more questions. Question 10, climate change causes what for sea levels and more what in the oceans? More what kind of oceans? All right, we are all correct on that one. Our next question, leaderboard, which has got a change in it again, and it is very tight at the top. What are long, narrow regions in the atmosphere that transport most of the water vapor outside of the tropics? We have one correct answer on that one. And it's even closer. We'll keep going. Our question 12, the Great Flood of 1862 in the Sacramento area was caused by warming ocean water. True or false? Correct answer there is true. Additional changes on our leaderboard. We have a few questions left, so if you're slipping down, let's see if we can make these make this exciting at the end. In California, rainfall is what? Uncertain from year to year. Our 14th question, water found below the water table is generally known as what? Couple options there taken. Our 15th question, what change is occurring in the Arctic Ocean because of climate change? Right. Glacier melting causes which of these? Question 17, tracking rainfall over a long period of time describes which characteristic of an area? That one is climate. We have more movement on our leaderboard as we come into the final couple of questions here. Which of the following contributes to global sea level rise? Answering quickly is important, but answering correctly is important as well. All right. Question 19, increased ocean acidification will what? Which of the following? Everyone got that one correct. And we have a very tight race here. And this last question is a special double question. It is Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with all of you. Which type of climate best describes planet Hoth from the Star Wars universe? That is tundra. No one got double points on that. All right. Our third place is Headwaters is awesome. Our second place is Kai Wu. Our first place, winner circle is Traffic Girlies. If you could take a screenshot of your score and send us that in an email. The top two, we have prize packs for both of you. Give us your name and send it to info@headwaters.org with a screenshot of your score, and we will get you your Headwaters prize pack. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. On behalf of Headwaters, I'd like to thank our panelists and our community for joining us. This event was free. We have super amazing sponsors in Jones Snowboards and the Tahoe Donner Homeowners Association who help support this event. And it is our big day of giving, and that's the perfect time to show your support for our science education programs, all of our students. You have until 11:59 p.m. tonight Pacific time, so any amount makes a big impact for our programs, and we would really appreciate any donations that you could contribute. Thank you all so much, and we will see you again soon for more programs coming up.